Well, welcome everyone to another episode of Architect Tomorrow. I'm really pleased that we've got another great group of friends and colleagues on this one. And again, we're spanning the time zone, so thank you, guests, for finding a slot that just about works for you, that allows us to have the span of the globe on this one. Um, so we're going to be talking about pragmatic governance on this one. This is a topic I've been wanting to cover for ages, actually, and so it's brilliant. I've got a quite different group of individuals here that work across different parts of the profession. So it's great that we have Selena and Darryl back for another episode. But welcome, Grant Ecker. We've done loads of things together, so I was like, I'm sure we've done an episode, and it turns out I don't think we have. So welcome, Grant. And it's your Chief Architect Network is fantastic. But maybe give those that don't know you from Chief Architect Network, maybe give everyone a quick background to who is Grant.
Sure, absolutely. So I've grown up in my career in technical path. I started out in development and project management and department leadership for collaboration technology across a couple different companies. General Mills is where I started, and then I went to Lowe's, where I moved into my first architect leadership role, kind of running the operations and governance. And from there, I started to do a bit of a rinse and repeat of taking reactive, small, centralized, and focused architecture teams into collaborative, forward-looking, and proactive architecture communities. So I've done that at Medtronic, where I graduated to become their chief architect. And then I continued in the chief architect role across Walgreens Boots Alliance, Danaher, and today I lead architecture at Ecolab.
Awesome, thanks, Grant. And I guess from your conversations across the Chief Architect Network, I'm guessing governance probably comes up quite a bit. Do you see it as friend or foe?
Oh, it's definitely friend. When you think about it as architects, if we aren't making decisions, if we don't have some bit of predictability to how we behave, either of those things can make us a valueless practice, right? We cannot be anticipated. Our actions can be seen as just ad hoc, which is dangerous. And then the alternative is we don't take a stand on anything, right? So why are you here? So I think it's really important that we show up in a way that is consistent, predictable, and by consistent, it's not just consistent in what we do, but consistent with what the organization expects and it ultimately needs from us. So it's really something that has to be tailored for each organization.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. And so, Selena, Darryl, last time we spoke, we ended the episode actually sort of starting to talk quite a bit about governance. And Selena, I remember you saying that sort of bad governance certainly slows things down, but good governance unlocks your innovation engine. Have you got examples, and perhaps we'll start with you, Selena, have you got examples of like both ends of the spectrum where you think governance has gone well and it's unlocked innovation, and others where it's just been overly bureaucratic and not worked?
Yes, loads of examples on both
Cool.
both ends of
I
the
thought you
spectrum.
would.
But unfortunately, mostly the bad kind. Governance has kind of taken a bad rap over the years because it can tend to be so bureaucratic and rules based and oriented around committees and cross-functional alignment that structures can make near impossible. So I think that bad governance kind of abounds. Good governance, however, I think that people are really starting to lean into it as more of like a learning function, a memory function within organizations, and that's where I see companies do really well is to look at it as what information do we need to make decisions in the right context to achieve the objectives that we have? How do we put that together? How do we make that work across workflows? How do we make that work across departments? And that's where things really start to sing because then it's more about alignment. It's more about steering. It's more about making good sound decisions for the organization versus the spirit of documentation that can tend to pervade like traditional governance as compliance checklist type of activities.
And I guess governance sometimes gets a bit of a bad rep because it's sort of seen as the Department of No or slowing things down, isn't it? And Yeah, I guess it's sort of, and ultimately, why I was keen to do this episode is I think there is a golden sort of balance, I suppose, between yeah, kind of alignment with the kind of cross-functional pieces you just sort of talked about, and getting stakeholders on board and aligned, but also not sort of being overbearing. Because I've been in organisations where the ARB or Architecture Review Board has been something that people have feared. It's like sometimes it's literally where careers are like made or broken. Like if you can't get your thing through ARB, you're not then seen as a good architect. And so, Darryl, you've got a fair bit of experience of like the banking world where like it's heavily regulated and clearly there's a bunch of challenges there. How you kind of balance that kind of pragmatic sort of approach. Have you got sort of experience or examples thinking in this space that sort of I suppose yeah points to where the right path is on this?
Yeah, thanks, Oliver. Yeah, it's interesting, and you say the banking industry is heavily regulated. Well, that depends on the time and it depends on the place. So I did some work at one of the big banks here in Australia for a while, and the entire industry was going through a re-regulation process at the time. So the government had stepped in and started to introduce new or reintroduce regulations to the banks. And I also worked in the compliance and risk change portfolio, which was $1 billion project portfolio for the
Right.
bank every year. So it was part of the conversation. So there was two aspects of governance then. There was the governance required by the organisation to meet its legislative obligations, which were being changed and increased on a regular basis. And then there was the internal governance practices about how we used our finite resources to enable the changes that were needed in the organisation. So yeah, there were two conversations about governance going on there. But of course, being in that space, it lent itself to being able to have meaningful conversations around governance because we were the team that was enabling the compliance with a raft of different legislations.
Yeah, I guess in my experience of banking as well, there's often those two takes, isn't there? There's the regulatory compliance almost program that you and but I think that the fact you're doing that tends to sort of I'm trying to think of a better word than infect, but tends to sort of influence the rest of the organization's thinking. Because I've also worked in retail organizations where it's like it feels very Wild West by comparison. And so, Grant, I know you've got experience not just yourself directly, but working with other chief architects across the chief architect network.
Yeah.
Would you say that that's your the general sort of stereotype is how heavily regulated you are determines how rigorous you are at architecture governance, or is that unfair?
It's not unfair. I would say that that sets the minimum. But I think the amount of governance you actually find in your organization is driven by culture, by the approach. Like if you're very process heavy, you might also follow that with a arduous governance connection because governance and process really kind of fit together. Um, Also, I really want to kind of play with the words you used earlier around that the Department of No. I mean, I really think of governance. If someone else's no or somebody's no is someone else's yes. Like if there isn't someone else that you're advocating for in that yes, or I'm sorry, in giving somebody steer away from what was proposed, you're probably not doing it right. So, for example, the decision to use a specific cloud technology is the cloud center of excellence is yes, right? And that somebody trying to bring something new in, they're getting a no because we're trying to optimize costs, make our operations better, et cetera. So I find that certainly you have a minimum bar of the effective governance of the compliance regulatory space required. Certainly in the med device space at Medtronic, we saw a lot of it was required. And then above that minimum bar is what are the goals and the strategy of the organization? Hopefully, those two things are in alignment.
Hmm.
Now, the governance should be set up to help the company achieve its goals aligned to that strategy and to challenge when those two things are out of alignment. Ultimately, that is what drives an effective governance organization. And the ones we hear about are the ones that bring a clipboard to the wrong event. And governance is now causing a cycle of sort of swirl because you've made a decision and said no, but the organization is actually saying yes. Now, the ARB and everything around it is now a distraction. It's now the enemy of the company. And you only get so many of those you can do a year And you better pivot quickly, because that steals away the entire value of what governance should be. Governance should be a moment where he goes, "Oh, right. Of course we can't do this because our broader goal is that." Thank goodness governance brought this to light at a time before we'd signed contracts and moved into execution.
Yeah. Yeah. And Selena, I'm going to sort of lean on your legal background a little bit here, and feel free to disagree with what I'm about to suggest. But like, I wonder if the reason we have such variance of architecture and technology governance in our organizations is, unlike the building profession or the medical profession, and Grant conveniently just sort of touched on, medical devices, and obviously we also touched on financial services, where there's a lot of regulation because clearly, the stability of the financial system is potentially disrupted by a system failure. And so I wonder if the reason we have this variance in architecture governance approaches is because it's not like, the building trade or medical, where there are quite clear things set down in law about, the way, someone has to be certified or the practices they have to follow. Does that explain why we have such sort of almost everyone striving for, for something that works, but ultimately a massive variance of approaches, do you think?
Oh gosh, I think there's a lot to
Yeah.
unpack in that. So I tend to also operate in regulated spaces, like I'm working with a med tech company right now. But they started as a technology company, and so they're very willing to revisit their precedent. Working for like pharmaceutical companies and whatnot, I see a lot more like resistance to challenging the status quo. So to Grant's earlier point, I do think that it's really cultural. I think that one of the things that I think a lot about is how the compliance profession and the legal profession has kind of grown up and how we're trained and whatnot. And I can't remember whether we talked about this the last time, but we're trained on precedent. We're trained to preserve, the integrity of the legal system and the regulatory system that is supposed to support our organizations. And so that lens can put us into a place where we really rely on the past. And when things are changing so quickly, and when the pace of change is coming the way that it is, the reluctance to look forward and be more anticipatory in the way that we govern things is a really hard shift to make for individuals, for companies, for, like think about all of the legacy assumptions that are built on that. Like, we fight a lot of like industrial era linear cause effect sort of architectures. The same thing applies in the governance space. And so you're really dealing with mindsets and paradigms and all of the things that are harder lift. So I think that in the highly regulated spaces where you have all of these rules that you can kind of rely on, it's very easy to default to what feels like very clear, very black letter law kind of structures, as opposed to thinking like, how is this law going to apply in this new environment? How might we be looking at, say, cloud infrastructure and what we might need to change in our policies to be able to accommodate this new direction that the company is getting? So I think that there's probably far too much to, to give like a really clear answer, but those are at
No.
least some threads that I think about.
It was a massive, probably whole podcast of a topic of a question. So sorry about that. But I want to sort of lean into something you just said there, which reminds me of like the immune system, which I think kicks in, right? Sometimes collectively, because let's look at this, like kind of large organizations. What do they exist? Well, they typically exist to sort of preserve their revenue stream, to manage risk, and I think there is a degree of the immune system, particularly around governance, is to sort of protect the status quo. And so sometimes you get situations where, yeah, it's really hard to introduce innovation and introduce new things if you're just trying to be very defensive and protective of the organization, right? And so I wanted to come back to something you said, Selena, around governance being sort of quite vital to, and I believe this too, but I'd be interested to sort of hear how you talk about it, how like governance ultimately, allows for innovation, particularly in a kind of complex organization that has risk sort of considerations and that sort of side of things.
I think I think that risk avoidance is like such a neat thing to think about. And like, I think that so much of what we have done has been built around risk avoidance, like think about like HR programs, for instance. Like, we want to create all of these different processes and all of these different rules around human resources to avoid risk. When in reality, what we kind of know now is more effective is to deal with that through culture and values and consistency and a perception of organizational fairness and all of these things. So I think that risk avoidance in and of itself creates a lot of unintended problems. It can create a lot of bureaucracy and these kinds of things. So really putting those two things together, risk and opportunity, and looking at things holistically and looking at like what you're trying to achieve and thinking about things more in terms of like risk tolerance, which is always contextual, and being able to provide like a contextual basis for governance and decision making is where that sort of mindset starts to change. I don't know if that really answered your question or not, Ollie.
No, 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 no it's a good answer. And where I want us to kind of take the conversation next, I suppose, is to ask you all the question of, does anything fundamentally change here when we start talking about AI? Or actually, is it just the latest sort of hyped technology that the governance boards need to look at through, critical lenses? And so, Darryl, I wondered if you had a sort of take on this. Is like, do any of the things that you've seen around the nature of AI, the fact it's non-deterministic, and the different sort of, the different sort of behavioral elements, I suppose, of the technology being a bit different in that regard. Does that make you think that we really need to govern this technology differently than other technologies we've seen come and go in the past?
I hate to do this to you, Ollie, but yes and no.
Great.
Yeah, so I, we still need to understand what the purpose is of introducing a new capability into the organization. So we need to understand how it delivers value, and we need to understand the consequences of the decisions that we're making around it. So clearly, there are things that are new about the application of the more recent sets of AI technologies. But from a business perspective, there's still the need to make appropriate decisions from a point of view of how you're investing your funds, how you're investing your resources in your organization, and what you expect to get from that investment. And so they are traditional governance conversations that can be had. They're prioritization, strategic planning conversations. So there's nothing new there. The subject matter might be a little bit different and might afford you new capabilities in your organization, or perhaps some form of differentiation that you might not have been able to get from, say, rolling out a new ERP or a CRM solution. So clearly there's something different, but in terms of making sure that your business is making the best decisions for whatever parties you need to make those decisions for, whether it's citizens or shareholders or stakeholders, the same fundamental questions are being asked. Is this the appropriate thing to do? What is the return that we're going to get on this? Is it more important than our other obligations that we have in front of us?
So Grant, I wondered if do you agree or disagree with the things that Darren and Selena talked about about sort of how AI maybe changes or how innovation changes the game around governance? I think you might be muted, or it's just me.
Well, Grant is figuring out his thing. Maybe we can take this a little bit, because when you had asked me the previous question, Ollie, I was thinking that Darryl might choose to talk about entropy a little bit, in one of his one of his famous things. Organizations are complex, and they have structures that have been built in other times, and the tendency over time for things to degrade and for things to become fractured, and in our attempts to control chaos and control things, we've kind of created a ton of bureaucracy. And when AI comes in, into these systems that may have gaps that we don't notice when things are more stable, or that have, these different things, I think it does kind of change the nature of how we want to think about governance. And maybe Darryl, you want to say a little bit about that until we get Grant back.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Selena. Yeah, so there's clearly there's some considerations around complexity that you need to think about in organizations. And the tendency is to go for the latest thing and add something new into the environment without addressing the complexity and the underlying issues that exist in the organization. So, adding AI into the mix doesn't necessarily make your organization better or easier to work with. It actually increases complexity, which is where the entropy conversation comes in. And so I go back to my original point that we need to make decisions about what is the best outcome for the organization. And I was speaking about this recently in an event about the need for us to do the hard work to fix the underlying problems that not only make the organization function better, but also enable us to be able to adopt these new technologies more effectively and get a greater return from them. So it's the hard conversations that we constantly distracted from by the messaging that comes to us as part of the hype cycle.
I'm glad you went there because I think we touched on this last episode about how potentially AI just makes your situation worse if the foundations aren't there. So for me, the governance sort of conversation is almost ensuring that the technical or organizational debt that might exist in a space isn't, kind of made worse by putting something on top of it, which will just shine a light on the major failings or holes that you already have. I'm hoping Grant is now back. Let's see. Hey, Grant, are you back?
Sorry about
Zoom's
that. It
no,
looks
I think it
like
was Zoom.
my rig partially rebooted. I have a couple computers involved, so of course I do.
Complexity. Oh, hang on. Are we going to have to take Grant's? I
Kind
think
of funny.
we might have to take Grant's IT setup through architecture governance because we may have just discovered a risk.
Yeah, I think we just found out what's going on there. So I'll use the Chief Architect Network's 5 themes to build on what Darryl had just shared. So principles based over rules based, enablement, not gatekeeping, AI governance plus risk controls, looking at the same kinds of things we're used to, like NIST and observability, security, holistic operating model, connecting silos, and versioned reference architectures with a stable baseline. So those two of those, right? AI governance and versioned reference architectures, I think, are the themes that expand. A lot of it's still the same. Keep us safe, right? We don't change the rules of data access. It's still role-based access, but there's new rules. We have to think in 3D chess because now we have to teach these things how to learn, how to think, how to act, and we have to govern those things. So that's a whole different dimension of governance than we've had to do in the past. Maybe you've had RPA, robotic process automation, but that thing follows discrete rules where it's an if this then that, where this is more of a probabilistic and it might take unpredicted action. So you have to figure out when a human needs to be brought into its loop, when it's not allowed to move forward, security, safety, that kind of thing, right? And the other thing we have to look at more than ever now is reference architectures and versioning to make sure that we're going about this in the same way. Not across the board. When you're doing innovation, you do innovation pilots, right? Then you might do some POCs that live in the center of excellence, and you're going to govern those so that you don't end up with 15 million ways to do agentic as you're getting started. And then you start to embed it into your organization, and that's where you codify it into standards. But you don't want to codify too early. The like RAG-based search, we can go ahead and have a single standard for. Agentic, we want to have some innovation pilots that have some degree of control, so we're not trying out everything in the kitchen sink. And then emerging stuff like agent-to-agent communication that no one's quite got figured out just yet. You want to do that more as an innovation pilot, where you're not really like deploying things to production yet. You're just trying out different things that could work and scale them. So I think
Yeah.
a lot of it's like innovation governance combined with um, a sense of the new problems that AI brings to bear and having the governance over what we should do as an organization, how an agent should act, and then not forgetting the basics of codifying things into under a simple understanding of this is the rules we're trying to protect ourselves from. We still need to protect ourselves from those rules as an organization.
And it was interesting hearing you sort of use the word sort of pilot around some of those more emerging capabilities because my sense from conversations I've been having is there aren't many organizations that are in heavily regulated, highly governed sort of spaces that are brave enough to put a lot of the agentic stuff though live into production yet. It's sort of limited experiments, it's limited pilots and trials. And so, yeah, I wondered if you've got examples that kind of counter that and actually have pushed all the way through sort of governance and have got their governance boards and stakeholders happy that actually this stuff can be put live. Because let's face it, we've seen examples where these things have had sort of when they've been left to their own devices, they've made discounts or they've made offers that are just quite radical that have got I think people worried about potentially allowing these things to make decisions, for example.
I think if we zoom out and think more about the AI machine learning space, not just so much agentic,
Sure.
we start to see some of the adoption. For example, Medtronic had a pill cam that would help prevent you from a very uncomfortable procedure if you're in your mid 40s, that ultimately would scan the entire trip down your intestinal system to find the polyps and things with AI identifying the parts of the journey that might have been interesting. So that was a decade ago, right? Um, you start to look at how they were doing optical scans at Google is one of the early use cases. Again, like before 2020, to be able to figure out with better accuracy than a doctor, do you have a forward concern in your eye health? So diagnostics have been an incredibly strong space for AI to assist. And you get around some of the regulatory because a human still looks at it and goes, yeah, that makes sense. I'm glad you pointed me to the
Hmm.
point I should be paying attention to in the tape. So I think it's really around when the AI is going to make a decision entirely on its own, where you have broader concern, but there's a lot of innovation that can be applied and has been applied even before this went mainstream. That's making a huge competitive advantage in the medical space.
I know, I totally agree that that kind of more narrow machine learning models, 100%. We've got loads and loads of examples of those in production. I think what's different is some of the language you were using just then, which almost implies a human level set of policies now need to start maybe being considered, where, previously we would have applied certain type of rules to more logical based systems. If you have a system that behaves more like a human, do you need to start kind of using more human based sort of rules? So I don't know, Selena, if you've got sort of experience in some of these conversations with organizations that are looking at some really sort of more bleeding edge use cases for this technology where, you know, the human decisioning. I mean, because personally, I have strong feelings about this, but I don't want to kind of prejudice accommodation, lead the witness too much. But yeah, what's your sort of take on organizations trying to sort of push to the like more the bleeding edge of the Gen AI sort of stuff right now?
Yeah, well, as a lawyer, leading the witness is like the whole game. So I feel like you should feel free to do that. No, okay. So yes, I am working with some companies who are doing some I would say interesting conceptual things with AI and generative AI. Nothing is in product even close to production. I think that people are starting to really understand the limitations of
Mhm.
large language models, which is what most of our agents are built on. There's some other really cool AI technology that might provide some really neat avenues for more deterministic types of outputs in more human-like thinking. But one of the first things that I say to anybody that when we're talking is let's not think about this as like human-like or human. It has a specific kind of intelligence that's built on specific mathematical parameters that we can put certain kinds of risk mitigation
Mm.
around to help constrain the way that it works that also have their own sets of consequences and upkeep and requirements built around them. So to be able to do that to be able to do something like that in a regulated space, I think is really, really challenging based on the models that we have now, and it doesn't make a ton of sense. I think that things like what Grant is talking about, decision support, whether you're talking about strategic decision to support or whether you're talking about decision support in like a clinical environment, is a really interesting space because you still have the human decision maker overlooking outputs and doing and taking in the relational knowledge that they've built up with a patient or the intuitive knowledge that they have by seeing and interacting with a patient in real life. Or like take a more bland example, like working on first pass of like promotional review in a regulated environment. It still ends up going through the process, but it might really help enable the initial like communication designers. So there's like wildly different contexts. There are wildly different scenarios in which you can apply these. So everything I think needs like a lot of care about what kind of intelligence you're looking for. Where should AI be brought in the loop? There's this great person who was like, let's stop saying human in the loop. Let's say AI in the loop and keep it that way. And that's, I think, the healthiest perspective that we can have around this, whether it's regulated or not. So,
Yeah, no, that's great. And I guess where my head goes is, and this is a word I struggle to pronounce, anthropomorphizing, which I haven't said properly, but I'll maybe, yeah, I don't know. But effectively, sort of treating these things as humans is possibly a little bit dangerous, um, because they aren't, quite frankly. They're a new innovative set of technologies. They happen to sort of speak a little bit like us, and or kind of create text that's a little bit like human generated text, but it's not. But they do fool us quite easily. So Darryl, I guess what's your sort of take on advice, I suppose, to people running governance boards right now that are maybe facing a barrage of new, exciting innovation sort of projects that are coming through, and sort of wanting to sort of gently, I suppose, let people to try and help people find the more pragmatic path for some of these innovations rather than, because I think unfortunately there's an awful lot of hype and FOMO and all that sort of stuff which we touched on the last episode out there. So yeah, do you have any sort of practical guidance for someone sitting on an architecture review board that needs to sort of slightly pop the bubble in some instances?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I do reflect back on our conversation from before about the idea of having principles that can guide decision making. And really, we're sort of generally skirting around the topic of decision support as part of what we do. So making sure that people understand the implications of the decisions that they're making, and they've got enough information to be able to understand this decision as a part of a whole about the strategic use of the resources in the organization. So if you can build up information that you can present to them in an easy to consume form that provides them more insight into both the consequence of the decision they're making and its place in a broader conversation about the organization and its direction and what it's trying to achieve and the value that you can generate, then they can make better decisions. So again, we're not introducing governance to stop people from or stop things from happening. We're introducing governance to enable the correct decisions to be made. And we're not making those decisions. We're providing support for the people who make those decisions. And so it's in our best interest and it's in their best interest that we apply the skills that we have as architects to understand more about the organization and make sure that that information is available and consumable.
about the organization and about the humans in the organization and that socio-technical, dance that we're having to do. I think that architects are in such an amazing position
Mhm.
when we have this technology that is changing how we interact with information. It is changing how we're interacting with each other. It might even be changing the way that we think. In fact, I think most neuroscience scientists are like, this is changing the way that we think. So all of that, like knowing all of that and how that applies to the structure and the things the technologies that we bring in and how they're adopted. I just think that architects are in such an amazing place to help bridge those conversations.
I totally agree.
Mhm.
We've been talking a bit around what are the themes. Can AI be used in healthcare? So I thought I'd give you a couple of the themes we've heard across the Chief Architect Network. Clinical decision support, biomedical and clinical language models, personalized patient care, medical imaging and diagnostics, hospital operations, resource forecasting, synthetic data simulation, digital twins. We're even using that to certify drugs these days. Healthcare policy, regulatory AI, medical coding and administrative automation, drug discovery. I saw a lot of that at one of my previous companies, and healthcare, cybersecurity, and risk management. Just a few. But
Yeah.
It absolutely is a trend, and we absolutely are seeing it applied across industries. It's absolutely fascinating, even in highly regulated organizations, just how far we can go.
Yeah, and so Grant, I was going to ask you like kind of an expanded version or a slightly tweaked version of the question I just asked the others, which is, what's your advice, I suppose, to chief architects that are, kind of leading, leading this sort of balance, I suppose, of driving innovation in their organizations, but also kind of, I guess, managing the risk and the governance sort of side of things. Yeah, what are your sort of top tips, I suppose, to chief architects around sort of AI and governing AI?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think one of the most important things, AI or otherwise, is understanding the evolving rules of the organization and aligning and codifying architecture governance to help bring the things forward that the organization is asking for. For a while, responsible AI was the buzzword. It's still used, but it's now kind of more embedded in things, right? Um,
I hope
so
so.
building the, what's that?
I hope it is embedded, but yeah,
It
carry on.
is. I'm seeing that a lot
Okay.
actually, but there's still, of course, the emerging space of decision intelligence where we have to figure out what responsible AI and decision making looks like. But
Hmm.
really understanding what those themes are, how the governance ought to be built to bring the right parties together, and then being the mechanism by which that happens, keeping in mind that the rules are not the same across the organization. The
Hmm.
metaphor I often use is that you might be trying to do cost out in your supply chain and trying to do customer intimacy driven innovation in your digital experience.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, right, like you often will see supply chain complaining, like, how come we have to root out all this application rationalization and we have one standard way of doing things? Where in commercial, they're trying out seven, eight different ways of trying. Well, that's because that's what our business needs us to do.
Hmm.
So even though it's not, quote, fair, it's not intended to be fair. It's intended to be directing company resources and agility to where the company needs it. So it's the same with AI, but what's different with AI is you have to be speaking with your colleagues, listening to shows like this one to understand what's coming and being ready to guide the organization in what they should be discussing, and then figuring out the right stakeholders to understand the go right, go left, which is where things like an AI council that might be skip levels to your CEO are giving you the legal, the cultural, the risk perspective, the regulatory perspective, name it, right? So these things all kind of get treed up to the group that's responsible for steering.
I love how you've just given a really practical example of the classic architecture line, it depends, right? Because
Yeah.
it's the same when it comes to governance, right? And in some parts of your architecture, you need it to be really cost efficient, really well risk managed. In other parts of your architecture, for commercial reasons or for other reasons, you might want to have multiple experiments going on or A/B testing or various other things happening. So that's a great example, Grant.
And I have one hot tip.
Okay.
The best way to figure out your governance is out of alignment is because your boss is yelling at you. Right? Like when you are using the wrong answer guide, right, for to grade a test, the organization will object. And
Hmm.
the moment the organization objects, it doesn't have to be your boss. It can just be an escalation in the business. But if you don't pay attention to that, it'll ultimately come down from the top. So when your governance is not aligned with the expected organizational outcome, the organization will tell you. It is your job to notice, be curious, figure out where your rules and rubrics aren't right, and adjust and explain this is why we were governing this way in the past. We've shifted, and to be able to put that new rule into context. Because the other thing that people won't tell you is that strategy somebody really loved 6 months ago, they might have stopped talking about it, but they're not going to shut it down. And we could still be echoing that in our decisions, but the company's moved on. So always pay attention to your objections and to your escalations, because those are the moments you have to learn and adjust your governance to what the organization actually needs.
It's a really good point. I think we've also touched on, or Darryl certainly touched on the decision support piece, because I think where this goes wrong is you have architects or even architect leaders who are on, in governance processes that are using their own personal gut feel a little bit too much. I mean, not saying that isn't the right thing to do in some situations, but in others, you really need to be aligned to like the organizational goals or the stakeholder sort of risk appetite rather than your own personal risk appetite as much. And I think where AI is a challenge here is it's incredibly divisive as a technology. Like you get any group of architects together, they'll have a range of different views on the risk appetite or its capabilities or what have you. And I guess the trick is probably to go, right, yeah, we may disagree as a group of architects, but actually, how do we align this to what the organization wants to do in terms of the opportunity versus risk kind of dimension, I guess.
Well, and what I love about what Grant was talking about is feedback loops. So this is Darryl will appreciate my preaching on this point, but that we get those so wrong so much of the time because we need to be sensing more holistically and more continuously around feedback loops, both in terms of like what is happening, how things are falling, how things are changing, the external environment, the internal environment. Those feedback loops all need to be structured and shaped. And we also need to make sure that we have feedback loops that are up at a higher level. Are we structured to be able to do what we're saying we're trying to do here? How is our, AI governance committee potentially structured to be able to fulfill our strategic objectives, not AI objectives, but strategic objectives? Is like, are we taking in the right information and spitting out the right information to enable decision making? And those kinds of feedback loops, I think, they degrade over time, so they require some upkeep. I think that they're not often thought about in traditional governance circles because we've taken such like a compliance and sort of like legal perspective on what risk management looks like. And so those feedback loops can be so, so powerful, whether you're talking about innovation, whether you're talking about like the information that you need, or whether you're talking about, emerging and changing risks. So, yay, feedback loops.
Yay, feedback.
Darryl, did you want to kind of comment on that, given that's one of your pet topics?
Look, I don't know what I could add to that. Just
Yay,
when
feedback.
Grant says yay feedback loops, I think we pretty much covered it.
Well,
And
but that's the thing. Like this is like an important thing. It sounds like so basic, but
right.
we rarely do a great job of closing feedback loops and reacting and acting in response. Like if you just get a bunch of feedback, that doesn't do anybody any good. But if you take it in, if you understand how things are changing and you like methodically adapt over time to what is needed, not in some like, willy-nilly way, like let's like move fast and break things, but in a way that is actually responding to the environment in which an organization is operating in. It's a really powerful thing, and AI can help enable those types of things, and also makes them more complicated. So it's important.
I'm glad you went there because we're running out of time to do this properly, but I also wanted to touch on where generative AI specifically might better help with architecture governance. And there's a few thoughts I've had on this topic, and maybe this is a future episode where we delve into it. But for me, the communication and feedback which we're talking about is crucial because often people running governance forums, people come in and they don't know what they're being governed against. And so for me, it's how do you easily publish concise summaries of the position that the organization currently has on a particular technology or a particular pattern or a particular approach that projects need to sort of be thinking about adhering to, or if not, they need to be justifying their non-compliance with. So that's one thing. And then I also think that generating some of the artifacts that then, drive the governance process can be quite time consuming. And actually, a lot of it is boilerplate. You look at the average high-level solution design or detailed solution design document, and there's a lot of repetition in there. And actually, do you want your architect spending an awful lot of time wordsmithing, or do you want them sort of capturing the essence of the decisions and then getting AI to help them document that decision? And almost the AI potentially also acting as a bit of a sparring partner to go, I'm going to take this to governance. Help me think about the questions that Architecture Review Board or my CTO or my chief architect is going to ask me about this project. So
Right.
yeah, whole new topic we probably don't have time to touch on, but maybe some quick comments on that. Like Grant, maybe you look like you're about to say something.
No, I just think you're spot on. I think AI is something that helps us harden our architecture practices. This is something not just even in the decisioning and authoring process, but we see it across the board in terms of application redundancies. We've had a number of presentations on automating your architecture review board, using a mixture of experts approach to have the AIs provide contrasting and differing opinions to help us harden our thinking. Certainly automating the connection of the architecture and the documentation of the architecture. But I believe that this is something where we've done entire talks and conversations where how is AI helping to speed up our architecture practices, and a lot of it is just out of the box, using a chatbot and appointing it to a repository. But as you start to hook it up to your EA tooling and MCP, there's some pretty incredible things where I think Gita Payne out of TIAA is bringing technical debt up to the board level because
Hmm.
she's able to codify it and explain it in a way that lets the organization plan. So a whole lot of emerging capabilities coming out of this space, and it's nice to see the EA function reinventing its relevance and its approach using emergent technology, not just governing the application of that technology across the organization.
Thanks, Grant. And as we're running
Yeah.
out of time, I want to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about Chief Architect Network. If we do have chief architects listening to this, which I believe we do,
Yeah.
yeah, well, tell folks a little bit about Chief Architect Network and where they can find out more.
Absolutely. So Chief Architect Network is a nonprofit 501c3 no-cost organization to bring together peer chief architects, people that manage 10 or more architects in their organization or have done that in the past, or are the leader of architecture for a billion plus revenue stream organization. So that really allows us to catch organizations and teams of significance and connect as peers that are leading architecture practices. Chiefarchitectnetwork.com is where to apply. Is no cost, as I mentioned. And it really starts to break down the barriers that we usually run into around commercial conversations getting in the way. It's really just a peer-to-peer volunteer network. So about 590 members now globally, and would love to expand that across 2026.
Awesome. And three of us, sorry, Darryl, to exclude you here for a moment, but I know travel for this one is a bit tricky for you. The three of us will actually be at a conference early next year. And depending on when this episode comes out, it might be after or before, or whatever. But anyway, won't worry too much about that. But yeah, the three of us will be at the TC BAF conference, won't we? And Selena, maybe you could say a couple of words about that one.
Oh, yeah, Twin Cities Business Architecture Forum. It's a great group of people coming together annually. Well, more than annually, tons of programming throughout the year. But this is for their big annual summit. And so we talk about the state of business and what is happening. AI will obviously be a big topic, but it is a really incredible place for professional development, a way to get a good holistic picture of what is going on in the business world and how we architects might respond to it. And great speakers and presenters. And I'm not just saying that because the three of us happen to be doing that. But
You're not saying it.
I'm not saying it. And I learned so much last year and just had an absolute blast. So I'm excited to be going back. A little chilly. So it keeps us huddled up and close together. So
Very
it's
good, very
Sure.
good. And Darryl, I'll give you the last opportunity to either add something that you wanted to add or to promote something that you're working on at the moment.
Well, I'm going to throw in a couple of things. One is I wish I could be there for the TCBAF conference. It looks amazing, and obviously the three of you are going to be on it, so that's worth the entry price by itself. But I just wanted to quickly go back to that conversation about feedback loops, and as I'm sure that some of you have already heard me talk about this before, but when I describe architecture, I say it's not really about the architecture. It's about people and it's about relationships and it's about communication. And if we can adopt these tools to free up more time so we can concentrate on those things, then we can have more impact on our organizations. And I think we can get some better outcomes.
Awesome. Well, that's a great way to close the episode. So look, thank you, all of you. As I said, appreciate the time zones. You've flexed your schedules to make this work, and that's massively appreciated. And yeah, look forward to hopefully getting you on another episode soon. So thank you very much.
Great to be
thank
with
you,
you.
So,
Ollie.
everyone.
See you guys.